Human history is a history of resilience, a constant, continued struggle against the forces of nature that existed long before us and will exist long after us. Climate change has forced ancient and modern humans alike to adapt with unwavering resolve. Changes in biodiversity pose a fragile balancing act that leaves little room for error. Crises of health threaten mass swaths of people. These forces are often unpredictable, appearing suddenly, sometimes leaving as quickly as they'd arrived, other times steadily weaving their way into daily life, with or without notice. The effect these occurrences have on society varies from era to era, from culture to culture, and can only be fully understood through the passage of time. Here in 21st century America, we exist in a polarized, individualistic society that habitually turns common sense, expert-backed crisis response into political and culture war fodder. In fact, we've recently been witness to the most contemporary instance of this phenomena. So what better example of how a natural force affects the critical machinations of a society than the onset of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, otherwise known as COVID-19? COVID laid bare the most brazenly incompetent aspects of the first Trump administration, especially as it pertains to crisis response, which only managed to reinforce the misconception that all government is disorganized and ineffective. The intersocial consequences of the pandemic are almost impossible to quantify. A combination of lockdown mandates, polarizing and isolating social media algorithms, and a growing malaise amongst the public accelerated the emergence of present junctures like the loneliness epidemic and the AI bubble. But it also managed to pave the way for political outbursts like January 6th, which was cultivated primarily through online communities like QAnon and by echo chambers that manifest into right-wing militia groups like the Proud Boys. Our shortcomings in taking collective action, both in our communities and in our government, to curb COVID spikes only epitomize the selfish nature of our cultural emphasis on individual outcomes above all else. These shortcomings were predominantly felt via the immense strain placed upon our healthcare system during the first year of the pandemic. With America's broken healthcare system directly in the spotlight, it would become clear just how unequipped this country is when faced with an emergency. Whether you choose to believe it or not, COVID still exists, and the outcome of America's response continues to develop to this day. Today, we're going to get the facts straight. We're going to discuss COVID's current place within public health, the shortcomings of our past, and what collective action is being taken to correct them. We'll also be discussing Austin DSA's COVID vaccination drive campaign with Ronnie from the campaign, along with volunteers from local COVID mitigation organization Clear the Air ATX to discuss their work within the community. Humanity is no stranger to pandemics. The differences, however, exist in how we've responded to them. From Austin DSA, I'm Marissa, and you're listening to episode 4 of the Austin DSA Batcast. As with any pandemic, the onset is filled with uncertainties. Diseases are moving and mutating in real time, meaning health experts are having to play catch-up as they watch things get worse before they can make them better. Yes, it's true that certain consensus about COVID has changed over time, the effectiveness of masks, how COVID is spread, and quarantine protocol, but understanding why that happens is where the disconnect happens. It's this aspect of disease control that laid the groundwork for a country already in the midst of its post-truth era to become even more divided. COVID was, and still is, a genuinely divisive subject for Americans. A Pew Research poll from 2024 showed 72% of Americans think COVID did more to drive the country apart than bring it together. This sentiment extends beyond the virus as just a topic of conversation, with the political fallout of the pandemic still looming large. Discussions about COVID within our congressional chambers and media are scarce these days, and that's probably on purpose. The Center for Infectious Disease and Research cites polling that shows 60% of Republicans saying COVID-19 is no worse than a cold or flu, with 76% of Democrats describing COVID-19 as worse than a cold or flu. That kind of polarity is problematic to say the least. As such, it remains as important as ever to make sure the realities of COVID are not just clarified, but emphasized as truth. I wish I could say it goes without saying, but unfortunately it does not. Therefore, I'm inclined to say COVID is very real and it's very much still here. In November 2025 alone, weekly infections in the US were still in the hundreds of thousands. Weekly excess deaths from the same time frame are happening by the hundreds. To date, over 1 million people have died from COVID. The belief that they died from something entirely fictional or unserious is an insult to the loved ones that lost them. Thankfully, the development and distribution of COVID vaccines throughout 2021 was a revelation, drastically reducing COVID deaths and alleviating symptoms. Still, many Americans met this necessity with hesitation. We could probably do an entire episode on the anti-vax movement and the repercussions it's had on our country's psyche, but we'll keep it short. The simple fact is that getting vaccinated minimizes your risk of illness and long COVID. along with reducing hospitalizations and death. So when you have the President of the United States and the entirety of his party continually questioning the efficacy and rationale of the vaccine, naturally, it's met with resistance by a sizable portion of the public. The lack of urgency and inconsistent, incorrect messaging ripped at the fabric of the country and completely neutered any kind of effective response. It had become clear as soon as attempts to flatten the curve were inadequate that instead of possibly eradicating COVID at its onset, we were going to end up living with it forever. For many, this made a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic an ongoing daily struggle. 2023 saw the quote-unquote unofficial end to COVID as a global pandemic. In May of that year, the World Health Organization declared that COVID is no longer a global threat, and the United States began to roll back public health emergency protections. The advent of the at-home test made tracking accurate case numbers difficult, and the CDC found that, quote, 99+% of the population is in a low community level, unquote, meaning COVID was having a limited impact on local healthcare systems and the severity of infections was low. Thus, reporting shifted away from individual cases and towards hospitalization data. While these changes were all based in real shifts, they were also indicative of the larger attitude towards COVID as hysteria began to mellow and general apathy towards anything to do with it set in. Let's be clear, the pandemic never really ended. The coronavirus has become something that we simply live with now. For some, it puts them out for a handful of days before it passes like it was never there. There may be times where they didn't know that they had it at all. For others, it remains a legitimate threat to their livelihood. As it's been since the start of the pandemic, those who are immunocompromised, along with older individuals, remain the most at risk of complications. Autoimmune diseases, cancers, HIV, and even certain disabilities can put people into immunocompromised positions where COVID symptoms become life-threatening. Additionally, the number of deaths among people over the age of 65 is 97 times higher than those among 18 to 29 years old. That is an astonishing number that highlights just how important it is to be conscientious of COVID even in 2025. Signs and symptoms have remained relatively constant up to now, and the idiosyncrasies of the virus remain just as persistent. One example of these is long COVID. Long COVID is a chronic condition that occurs after SARS-CoV-2 infection that includes a wide range of symptoms or conditions that may improve, worsen, or be ongoing. They can last from a couple weeks to a few months to several years. Furthermore, because COVID can be contracted multiple times, anytime you become infected, you put yourself at risk of developing long COVID. What's particularly frustrating is just how ambiguous it is, with symptoms that emerge, persist, resolve, and reemerge over weeks and months. From respiratory issues to neurological issues to digestive issues and then some, there are more than 200 individual symptoms of long COVID that have been reported. These symptoms and conditions can even result in disability. While rates of new cases of long COVID have decreased since the beginning of the pandemic, it remains a serious public health concern as millions of U.S. adults and children have been and continue to be affected. Long COVID can be debilitating and is largely flown under the radar within the larger timeline of the pandemic. This negligence from both the public and our government amplifies the significance of just how necessary preventative measures continue to be. Masking and social distancing, while not definitive, were still useful protocols for mitigating spread of infected aerosols, yet these policies are basically unheard of now in both public and private spaces. For a long time, it was thought that infected surfaces were a primary spreader of COVID, but that consensus shifted over time to where it is at today, that COVID is predominantly airborne. Because of this, preventative measures now take a much more multi-layered approach. The Swiss cheese model, as it's known, details the techniques and safeguards required to help mitigate lifetime consequences of COVID. As the virus passes through a layer of, say, high-quality masking, it becomes progressively difficult to pass through each subsequent layer, i.e., maintaining clean indoor air, vaccinations, and so on. The gradual retraction of pandemic-era public health policy saw a lot of this pre-existing infrastructure and community ordinance dissipate. Now more than ever, it's the responsibility of the individual to keep themselves safe, with those who are most at risk getting left behind. COVID safety is an intersectional, working-class issue that affects everyone, and it came to evolve by the same mechanisms which establish most crises in this country. Decisions were made by those in power, and those with capital, in their best interest with no regard for their impact. Because of this, local grassroots community groups have had to take matters into their own hands to keep their communities safe. Today, we're joined by members of one of these groups, Austin's own Clear the Air ATX. Launched in December of 2023, the volunteer-run disability-led operation works to make spaces safer by reducing viral transmission through lending HEPA air purifiers and far UVC devices, as well as distributing tests and KN95 masks. all free of charge. Aside from masking, scientific data indicates that HEPA filtration is one of the best tools for filtering out airborne viral particles. This includes COVID, and it's why air purifiers are the main component of their library. For a city whose live music scene is so integral to its identity, the lack of public resources for creating clean air in venues and other places where crowds gather felt like an aberration. Just like access to clean water, food, and medical care, access to clean air is a human right. To ignore this is to exclude those already compromised by the negligence of our elected officials. Clear the Air seeks to step up where those elected officials failed. With us today from Clear the Air ATX are Naveen and Alyssa. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. So first question to start with the basics. How did Clear the Air ATX get started, and what gap in Austin's public health landscape were y'all looking to fill?
Yeah, so Clear the Air started in December of 2023. Our founder, Katie Drackert, and Gabby Benitez came together after having attended a COVID support group and basically wanted to challenge the kind of broad spreading like pandemic apathy that they were facing in all of their communities. Katie, in particular, has long COVID, and so it was very, very personal to them because they had been, kind of seen everyone move on, and their own body would not let them move on and let them kind of forget about COVID in the way that many other people around them were doing. Um, and so they started it in order to be very solutions oriented with how to challenge and push back against the narrative of, oh, COVID is over, we don't have to worry about that anymore. And Katie and Gabby were very much like, no, COVID did not go away. It is still very much an issue. And if it is, a prevalent issue that we all have to acknowledge and deal with, what kind of tools and resources can we offer the community to be able to mitigate the spread of airborne pathogens and mitigate the spread of disease and keep our community safer because it's not reasonable to just keep everyone inside forever and, cut off all of our axes of social connection, especially for Katie, who came from like a performance art background and was like almost essentially like a full-time performance artist prior to developing long COVID. That's not a space that you can do, like, that's not a job that you can do remotely. Um, and so in the performance art and nightlife space, that was really where Katie kind of started the project of like, how do we make it so that artists who, lip sync artists who cannot mask when they're performing because it relies on people seeing their mouths, um, other performers who, wear makeup or like have part of their acts and part of their profession doesn't really allow them to take individual mitigation measures that way. How can we keep them safe because they need to work, they need to be able to make a living for themselves. And clearly people are still going to go to the shows. So what can we do to make both the attendees and the performers safer? Um, so that was how Clear the Air was born.
Amazing. That kind of leads us into our next question. Why did your team decide to focus on specifically air purifiers, far UVC devices, and masks?
Yeah, so in 2021 and 2022, so much of the public health messaging around COVID was like, we just need to learn how to live with COVID. And I think a lot of that for leaders meant that we're just going to ignore COVID, we're going to downplay COVID severity, we're going to shut down safety measures because if we ignore it and we look away from it, then that's us learning how to live with it. Um, and so what Gabby and KD, and I think a lot of folks in the COVID informed space have acknowledged is that learning to live with COVID actually means providing some of those tools in order for people to feel safe in these public spaces or in spaces where they're gathering with other folks. Air purifiers, far UVC devices, and masks are some of the highest impact but lowest effort mitigations that people can take that help lessen the spread of airborne illness. And they do so really effectively. So masks in particular, and I know we'll talk more about some of the different ways that air purifiers specifically work, but masks in particular are such a key mitigation effort. The People's CDC talks a lot about how other mitigation tools like the purifiers or far UVC testing are not necessarily substitutes for masking in and of itself, because some of these tools can vary so much depending on the room size, the number of people in the room, and different factors like that. And masks are affordable. Air purifiers and far UVC devices when there are resources like Clear the Air, other Clear Air lending libraries do help to make these tools more accessible to folks who might not otherwise be able to get them.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that context. So, for listeners who may not know, why is clean air such a powerful tool against airborne viruses, specifically COVID?
Yeah, I think the important context when like explaining the benefits of air purifiers and HEPA air purification to people is making sure that they understand what airborne transmission actually means. Um, Alyssa and I actually did a workshop a few weeks ago, kind of contextualizing and explaining where we are in this moment, almost 6 years into the pandemic, uh, and how here's all the information that you might have missed after you kind of checked out. And here are the, the practical, tangible ways that you can try to reduce the spread of viral illness in your own life. And these are the steps that you can take as an individual, but these are also additional measures that you can try to implement in more group or systemic settings where you have the opportunity to. So initially, when COVID first started, the theory of spread was that it was transmitted through droplets, like the cold and the flu. So that's why everyone was wiping down all of the surfaces. The dominant narrative was like hand washing, stay 6 feet away, because droplets are, if you think about when somebody like sneezes, they're particles that are like visible, you can feel them, they land somewhere. And as as the research continued, as the virus evolved and we started learning more about it, I say we as if I'm a public health person. I am not. This is very DIY. We had to do our own, education and learning in order to like get up to speed and try to understand what was going on. Um, but let me back up. So, uh, researchers and medical professionals and public health professionals um, realized that it was not the primary mode of transmission was not actually droplets, it was airborne. And that distinction is very important because airborne viruses and other pathogens can basically, if you think about if somebody was inside a room with you smoking a cigarette and how that smoke stays in the air, it doesn't like land, it doesn't fall. It dissipates to the point where you can't see it, but it's still all around you and you're still breathing it in. Especially if you're in a room with no or low ventilation. And we know from decades of research how damaging, inhaling secondhand smoke can be. So that's one of the main, like, I guess, metaphors or analogies we've been using to try to get people to understand what that means. So if you're at a gathering with people and somebody there has COVID and maybe they're asymptomatic, they don't know it, and they're breathing out, they're laughing, they're talking, maybe they're singing karaoke. Every time they breathe, they like exhale, viral particles are going out into the air. So everyone else in that room, the more that person talks, hangs out, breathes in that room, the higher concentration there's going to be. So everyone else is breathing that in. Here's where an air purifier comes in. You add an air purifier that, is the right size for that space and the right power for that space. Um, and now the air in that room is being circulated through a filter, recirculated out, and the filters in these like high efficiency air purifiers are able to catch particles, like viral particles that are super small. Um, so then the air that is circulating in the room, the viruses are being trapped and getting constantly pulled out so that it's not concentrated in the room. The other thing that is very beneficial is opening windows. Because ventilation, get a cross breeze, the more air that's coming in and out of the room is going to make the concentration of viral particles in the air dramatically lower, which will curb transmission. And it's not just viruses that air purifiers help with. This is another point that we try to underscore is that this is beneficial for so many more reasons. Um, if you like have a roommate who is maybe a smoker, it's going to catch smoke particles. If you light a lot of candles, it'll catch the smoke particles from that. Um, anything you like, if you're cooking with like alcohol, that's going to release a bunch of like volatile organic compounds. It'll catch those. Allergens, if you have pets, uh, if it's like a if it's cedar season in Austin and you have your windows open and you're all like itchy and your face is all like, your nose is drippy, it's going to help catch those things as well. So it's really like beneficial for so many reasons, like a much broader range of things than just viral transmission. But that's why our primary focus is on um, air purifiers.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that information. I can attest to air purifiers being great. I have one in both the rooms in my house because I am a consistent candle lighter and I have a long-haired dog that sheds constantly. Um, but yeah, I mean, that information was so important about specifically COVID being an airborne virus because I feel like that was like the big information that had started coming out once like COVID communication started breaking down. And the fact that like you said earlier, like you're not a public health professional and had to like learn all this information on your own, um, it kind of speaks to like I don't know if ethos is the right word, but like the ethos of y'all's group is that like you really have to take matters into your own hands. And like how y'all got started with someone who is directly dealing with complications of long COVID. Um, like, yeah, having to learn all this information themselves and like find a way to communicate it to people, um, and create the lending library, obviously. Which leads us to our next question. Your group is disability led. How does that perspective shape your work and your priorities?
Yeah, so Naveen had mentioned that Katie has long COVID, and obviously that drives a lot of the work. I also ended up developing long COVID after getting involved with some of the clear the air work and being in some of these like COVID informed spaces. And I think for us, we have that personal motivation, we have that personal lens, but it's also knowing that we are tapped into some of those disability justice spaces and the ways in which, like, if we can address disability justice, it only serves to support all people across like all marginalities. I think our group never claims to represent all disabled people or all the different like axes of marginalization that people can face. And we also know what it feels like to be shut out of spaces when they no longer are accessible, either in like the physical sense, in the illness mitigation sense. And so we want these spaces to continue to be accessible for people because we know that COVID has become this mass disabling event that, is more top of mind affecting certain people than others, but that touches all of our lives, I think, whether or not folks are recognizing and acknowledging that. So I think, that drives a lot of the mission is like we want to get purifiers into as many spaces as possible to make events, gatherings as accessible as possible. But we also do think about the ways that different event organizers prioritize other accessibility measures as well. Like, are you thinking about having your event at a place that is also wheelchair accessible and has wheelchair accessible parking? Especially when folks are hosting mask required events, we try to be additionally supportive of those because it is another cost for folks, and we want to be really mindful of that. And it can make a space so much more safe for when it comes to the airborne illness mitigations. And so we do provide masks for mask required events. So it obviously shapes a lot of like our external facing, like what work we actually are producing. I think especially when I reflect on our Clear the Air showcase, our Age of Aquarius show that Naveen and Katie were the MCs for, we did put in a lot of thought into like where are we going to host this? How can we host this in a way that is accessible for as many people as possible? Obviously, right, there's always like things to do better and include in future events. But, we thought a lot about like, again, the parking, whether or not it was going to be accessible for people with all kinds of mobility devices, how to also make it accessible for folks who maybe are homebound. And so we had a virtual streaming option because I think that's something that is hard to consider, right? Is that there are people we don't even see who have already been shut out of spaces. And then I think also behind the scenes, and I think Naveen, Katie, Gabby, Dylan, we have all been in a lot of like progressive leftist organizing spaces where things move at such a fast pace. There is like really no brakes on the car. And one thing I really appreciate about the way that we do things like Clear the Air is we try to really strike that balance between like there are obviously urgent needs for our community and in having these resources. And we are like several disabled folks or caretakers for disabled folks. And it's important for us to have that balance of also being able to take care of ourselves because at the end of the day, if we can't sustain our bodies and our health in all the senses, then there isn't going to be work for us to do because we're going to not have anything to give.
Yeah, that's so important is making sure that you're taking your care of yourself at the same time, even while trying to fill in massive gaps in our like community resources. So, like you were talking about making spaces in our community more accessible, where specifically are your devices going? Are they going to venues, classrooms, homes, or events?
They're going to lots of different places. I think we're really lucky that a lot of our folks who are event organizers or event producers do a whole lot of different things. So there are people who are involved in nightlife. We have a lot of drag performers, different dance companies, other type of performance art that use the purifiers quite a bit. We've had a lot of community events and different venues host the purifiers. Over the summer, we had different businesses in Austin or different organizations in Austin host purifier residencies. So Alienated Majesty Bookstore was one of them. Out Wellness down south was one of the purifier residencies. And so we looked a lot for that instance at spaces where people were often hosting events there, or were like high flyer purifier renters. And so we wanted to make sure that those purifiers could be in those spaces more consistently. We've also seen a lot of organizers and advocacy groups using the purifiers, and I think again, like coming from that background of doing like a lot of mutual aid organizing, a lot of like leftist organizing, to me, that is like one of our most critical spaces to be in addition to the nightlife for like reasons that Naveen mentioned. But with our organizers and advocacy groups, it's also important, there's so much work that we do to protect each other's community, to stand in solidarity with each other's community. And in these spaces, we have to also protect each other in the like physical health sense. And I know that for my experience, having long COVID has really changed how I'm able to show up to organizing. Like I can't show up at the same clip with the same kind of intensity on front lines that I used to. And it's something that I think we need to continue talking about in leftist spaces is that like we all know about burnout, but I think we also need to talk a lot about how COVID is affecting our communities in all senses of the word. But yeah, we've had a lot of reach. We've had people use the gear for over 550 events, which feels like wild for a team of volunteer organizers who like do this in addition to having jobs. And we've actually just launched our personal purifier library. So we launched it at the beginning, I think it was at the beginning of November, as a way for folks to also use the purifiers. If you have a roommate who is sick and you don't want to get sick because you can't afford to take off time from work, or you just don't want to get sick because being sick sucks. Like we have the purifiers for that. We also have them for if you're having a baby shower or a birthday party and you want to be able to take those precautions, but you can't afford a purifier. We do have these resources now more readily available for folks.
That's amazing. I love that idea of yeah, that y'all opened like a personal library lately. And the residency idea is so cool. So, for people who maybe aren't community event organizers, but are event participators, and maybe notice that like an event that they want to go to hasn't announced that they're taking COVID mitigations or anything like that, what could they do on their end to advocate for COVID mitigations and maybe get the event to be in contact with y'all?
Yeah, great question. I would say it depends on the person's capacity. Again, being a disability-led org, I feel like that's something we're constantly checking in about. Is like, what is your capacity to do this thing? Um, and so I think if the person has the capacity to say, hey, I'll book the purifier and I'll go pick it up and I'll bring it to the event, I would say like do that and check in with the event organizer. I haven't heard of an event organizer. We've had this happen a couple of times with our different purifiers where someone's like, "Hey, I'm not the event organizer, but I have checked in with them and they're cool with me bringing a purifier." I think that's like one way to approach it, particularly if the participant has a relationship of some sort with the event organizer. I think the other thing is just to like ask. It's the unfortunate thing of, being in relationship with each other is like folks aren't mind readers. There's a lot that is like going on for people, and I think in the spirit of giving people the benefit of the doubt, it might just be something that they haven't thought of before, that slipped their mind. And so asking the event organizer if they would be interested in booking a purifier. Sometimes we'll do that as an organization for events that maybe selfishly we want to go to, or that we know will be like really popular events in different communities. So I think it never hurts to ask, and offering to support that effort where you can, I think always can make it easier for event organizers.
Yeah, totally. And I'll just add that maybe if you don't, if it's just an event or series of events that you go to, but you don't really have any relationship with the event organizers, um, if there is a suggestion or like feedback related form that they send out to all the participants afterwards, that could be a great place to have a little bit more distance, for you to, share your thoughts and feelings, and plug the resources that you think that organizers should avail themselves of. But also, if you notice, if you're at the event and you see that they have taken the time to implement other accessibility measures, like if you noticed, yeah, there was a ramp, there are disabled accessible bathroom stalls. Maybe it's like a nightlife related show or like a concert, and you notice like, oh, actually, there were no strobes in this show. I wonder if that was intentional. So if you notice that they have taken the time to implement other accessibility measures or just have access as part of their event planning protocol in some way, that's a really great in to be like, hey, I noticed that, you advertise this as an accessible event, or, thank you so much for having XYZ. I really appreciated it. Have you considered, you know, adding, increasing your access to a broader range of folks and keeping everyone, all attendees, regardless of like ability, um, keeping them safer? There is this, you know, you can say whatever you want to say about us, but like there's this really great org called Clear the Air, and they have air purifiers that we can borrow for free, and use at our events. It would mean a lot to me if you would really consider like using the air purifiers and having them at your events in the future. Okay, thanks, bye. Yeah, I think I am always of the mindset of like trying to meet people where they are, acknowledge the work that they're already putting in, because like Alyssa mentioned, we're all so busy all the time. Like in whatever respective circles you're running around in, just waking up every day and trying to just like navigate the hellscape of this world and like ha carve out little pockets of joy. And so in approaching folks, like take a good faith approach, and just ask. A lot of people just not in are not acting maliciously, or their inaction is not necessarily malicious. It is just a lack of information about the resources that exist. Um, and then like we said earlier, just having to combat the pandemic apathy and the prevalent like mis and disinformation, that it's very, very easy to, you know, to think that is in fact like the truth, I guess. And so meeting people where they are and engaging in good faith, tends to work a lot better than a angry, shame-based approach, of these people suck. Like it's never gonna work super well if you just start by, posting, a cancel take on Instagram of like these organizers are super ableist because they didn't do these things. And it's like, well, did you have a conversation with them? They might be very, very willing to do these things, and like maybe they did not have the capacity to think about it. Maybe somebody's not brought it up to them. And if you're that person, great. Wouldn't you like to help them instead of yelling at them from the sidelines? And maybe you don't need to be the person doing all of the intense labor to get them to use the service, but just bringing it up is step one. Um, and that's my approach, and that's the approach that we try to take at Clear the Air as well.
Totally. Yeah. A lot of the times the like hardest and most necessary like task is just being the person that says something. And yeah, like you said, it's so important to like approach it with like assuming the best of the other person, like that they want to, create an accessible space or event or whatever, and they, you know, bringing it up to them will, spark something in them that will actually make it happen. Next question. What are the biggest roadblocks that y'all have faced so far? Is it funding, political will, public apathy, or infrastructure in general?
I think, I mean, all of the above, but I think primarily the biggest barrier is public apathy. Like we've already talked about, the general attitude, like the dominant attitude among people is that COVID is over. People talk about the pandemic in the past tense, and at least once a week, if not more, when I'm talking to somebody, I'll hear them use the phrase, oh yeah, during the pandemic, I did this or this happened or whatever. And I'm like, the pandemic is now. It is unfortunately still happening. And I say unfortunately, and it's because I feel like I am being the bearer of bad news whenever I'm talking to people, but I'm not trying to bring down the vibe. I am telling them this. I'm telling people this because this is the reality that we are living in, and the vast majority of people, not by their own like ill intent, but because the news, the media, the people that are, running the government have all collectively decided that the pandemic is over. And so if you're not digging into the research, if you're not deep in this the way that like Alyssa and I and like the other people involved with like Clear the Air and the COVID vaccine drive from DSA, like if you're not looking at it and paying attention, like you would have no idea. Um, because the systems that are designed to keep us informed have been bought out by like corporate interests who are like, well, our bottom line is more important than having people continue to be able to work from home or have free healthcare, like free COVID tests and COVID vaccines. That's not important. We need people back to work. We need people spending money and like going out and living their lives as normal. So challenging that, like Alyssa was saying, like we're a small team, like we're a scrappy team of like five people, and like when people are like, "How do I get involved with like Clear the Air?" or like Clear the Air's like, "How do you guys organize?" I'm like, it's five of us in a group chat, like it's literally like a signal chat, and I'm really, really like proud of us and like how much we've been able to accomplish. Um, just like kind of despite all of the factors working against us. But yeah, challenging that apathy and getting people to even care enough to listen. And then once they listen, internalize that and then take the next step and put it into action by trying to do something. Example, renting a purifier. Um, for their event to try to then make the event safer and put actual mitigation measures in place. And so it's very much an uphill battle that way. And it takes a lot of individual conversations. It takes a lot of making people have to confront things that they are probably going to bring up a lot of uncomfortable like emotions and a lot of defensiveness. And it's really, really easy to lose people once they start, getting defensive and feel like they are being chastised or reprimanded or something. Because it's like, and that's very much like we don't want people to feel that way. We're trying really, really hard in having these conversations to be compassionate and while educating people, um, and giving them the opportunity to take matters into their own hands in a way, and quite literally, um, in order to protect their community, especially in leftist organizing and advocacy spaces where the common goal is, fighting on behalf of marginalized groups of people. Um, Disabled people are part of every other single marginalized group. And it is a marginalized group that you can become a part of yourself at any time. And so there's like a kind of like a glib, like, phrase that gets tossed around. It's like you either die or you live long enough to see yourself become disabled. And so everyone will essentially become disabled in some way at some point in their lives, or they will die before that happens. So it really behooves everyone to care about taking care of disabled members of their community, ensuring that people who are immunocompromised or have other chronic illnesses are able to participate in these spaces. Because, like Alyssa said, a lot of these people are maybe homebound or are maybe unable to engage as much out of the house or engage in as much advocacy and organizing work as they would like to because their capacity is diminished. Um, and their voices and their experiences like all still are incredibly important in how we navigate this, in ensuring that our communities, we're actually caring for our communities, not just the parts of our community that are easier to care for. I guess the other part is like funding, and we're, applying to grants and doing the best we can. But the educational, like, combating the apathy is, I think, truly the biggest challenge because once we've been able to kind of reach people and the groups that have been repeatedly utilizing our services, once we've explained it to them and they get on board, then that's great. Then we have other kind of, advocates on our behalf. other like, community ambassadors that are spreading the gospel or who are helping us do that education kind of like in an ad hoc way. And that's tremendously helpful because then we don't have to have all of the individual conversations. And when your friend recommends something to you, or a colleague or somebody else, you're going to take that probably more seriously than if a stranger does. So the wider net we're able to cast, the better this is hopefully going to get for us and everybody.
And one thing I'd add too is that, like, obviously with fascisming harder than it ever has, I think at least so explicitly, and in like such a mainstream visible way in our lifetimes. I do have a lot of compassion, and I think it like does depend on the day. I have a lot of compassion for the way that folks are just like, I am like grasping for joy wherever I can get it, and feeling like taking COVID mitigations is like a barrier to that. And I think in like at least in our group in other like COVID informed spaces I'm a part of, we're like, you can wear a mask and you can shake ass. You can be at some place with a purifier and also like feel a lot of joy. And so I think that there is like a perceived like really high startup cost for some of these things. And a lot of what we're hoping is that by like doing the education we can, by building the network we can, like Naveen was saying, that like people see that some of these startup costs are much smaller than I think they get made out to be.
Totally. Yeah, and I like the emphasis that y'all put on like the clean air focus earlier, is that it actually really is like a low commitment like thing to put forth, like or policy to have, having air purifiers, opening windows. It's really amazing like how much that y'all have been able to accomplish being such a lean team. I think you said like 5 people or something in the past 2 years, and have been able to, participate with over 550 events. And kind of like you were saying, like the more that the air purifiers and the far UVC devices are appearing and at different events, like the more that people like are seeing that, and they're like, oh, more events should have air purifiers, and then it becomes like a normalization. But that kind of leads me to my last question for y'all, which is how can individuals request a purifier, volunteer, or support your lending library?
Yes, there are lots of ways. I think like there are easy things like filling out the forms, but the thing that Naveen mentioned around spreading the word and really like promoting that you're using clear the air purifiers, I think goes a long way more than us just like repeatedly telling people like, hey, we have a link in our bio where you can rent these forms or where you can fill out a form to rent our purifier. That's where they are. They're in our Instagram bio. There's a link for the personal purifiers, the event purifiers, and then the volunteer. But I think just telling people that you use them, I think like there's such a stigma around COVID precautions or like airborne illness precautions. Um, and like you said, making it normal and like just a part of what we do really helps a lot in terms of getting the word out there and making people feel like, okay, it's like not a quote unquote weird thing to book a purifier. We do try to make it really easy. I would also say that we really love having volunteers who can help support this work. So we're all volunteers. We just kind of have like learned things and started doing them, as with like many leftist projects, I think. So anytime people want to volunteer, support us with grant writing, dropping off purifiers places, picking them up, we have no shortage of things that volunteers could do if people want to get more involved beyond booking the purifiers. These things are also on our website. We have a website. It's cleartheairatx.com. No spaces, nothing in between. And all the forms are also on that website if people aren't on Instagram for whatever reason. And then donations always help, but are certainly not required. But donations help us get the gear like masks, filter replacements, replacement parts, stipends for our volunteer drivers. So any and all forms of support are certainly welcome right now.
Amazing. Thank y'all so much. That was really like a wealth of amazing information. So thank y'all so much for joining us today and lending us your time.
Yeah, so happy that you asked us to be here and that you're doing an episode on this. I'm just glad that more people like outside of our orbit are wanting to like have meaningful conversations and like be part of that public education, it particularly in leftist spaces because it is oftentimes like unfortunately one of the one of the topics that just gets sidelined or is an afterthought or just does not get included at all. Um, and so it's very, very heartening and encouraging to be part of these conversations in these spaces. So thank you.
Of course, yeah, we need to keep our comrades healthy, keep our spaces accessible so that as many of us can participate in the movement as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank y'all. The present day relationship that Americans have with COVID was not the result of any one singular policy decision, but the outcome of several political and non political factors. Masking policy, lockdown policy, George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, economic calamity, vaccines, China, every facet of the pandemic compounding on top of the foundational tension of an election year. COVID dominated headlines and dictated the lives of every American in unprecedented ways, culminating in the new normal, a term that exists under the pretense that there is a new standard for things going forward. But here we are, 5 years later, and it seems like we've done everything we can to return to the old normal, an impossibility no matter how hard we try. It feels hard to believe that wearing a mask in public or private spaces was a legal requirement for a time. What started as a collective effort to mitigate the spread of COVID devolved into a culture war debate over personal liberties. This turned masking policy into a wedge issue that became easier to ignore than to address. In a lot of ways, it feels like the anti-mask side won. Masking is the clearest example of early pandemic prevention methods eventually being tossed aside in the hopes that we all just forget it ever happened. The funny thing is, masking itself isn't even particularly reviled. The Public Health Policy Center de Beaumont saw 71% support for masking policies during the pandemic and for use in future pandemics. Similarly, polling from the Harvard School of Public Health shows that 70% of respondents found masking requirements in stores and businesses to be generally a good idea. In fairness, the National Institute of Health has found that adherence to mask wearing recommendations was always low, but it typically increased when incorporated into actual policy. No matter how you square it, the fundamental aspect of wearing a mouth cover during an airborne viral pandemic was always a known, low commitment safeguard. But these days, you'll be hard pressed to see more than a mask or two in any public setting. While masking typically gets all the mainstream attention, another overlooked component to prevention that's just as crucial has also been left behind. Clean air initiatives naturally came with the territory of the pandemic. Filtration, ventilation, dilution were all important strategies improving the quality of air in enclosed areas. The Biden administration even published indoor air quality guidance and made congressionally approved funds available, quote, that can be used in schools, public buildings, and other settings to improve indoor air quality, unquote. These would, of course, all be rolled back eventually, but we'll get to that in a second. Unlike masking, which is primarily focused on individual efforts, clean air initiatives rely more on a commitment to changes in infrastructure by cities and property owners. This could look like upgrades to HVAC systems, the regular use of portable air cleaners, or even an increase in air quality standard enforcement. But the lack of any real commitment on this front has shifted the responsibility from the federal government to the private sector. And unsurprisingly, asking any major business to alter their bottom line is futile. So what changed? If masking is so helpful, and clean air has come to be a vital piece of the puzzle, why did we jettison these crucial prevention methods? Ultimately, our media and our politicians made the decision to move on from COVID. Both the CARES Act in 2020 and the American Rescue Plan in 2021 were crammed with a ton of sweeping initiatives that not only helped alleviate the public health calamity in the moment, but put forward drastic social safety nets that genuinely made people's lives better. The eviction moratorium, stimulus checks, and the child tax credit are a few of the big ones. The child tax credit alone cut childhood poverty in America by nearly half. The pandemic may have ended in technicality, but by rolling back pandemic era health and economic policy, COVID has continued to flourish in more ways than just getting sick. We saw the largest wealth transfer in history happen in this period, exacerbating America's affordability crisis. As health outcomes are commonly associated with income and living standards, America got sicker and poorer. Cynics might argue that this is by design, and given what we know, it would be hard to call it cynicism as opposed to realism. Whether it's corporations prioritizing profit or politicians prioritizing re-election, it's clear that the people in charge were done with worrying about COVID, and they wanted you to be done with it as well. Thankfully, we have people right here in Austin that continue to work on making our community safer and healthier. As of late 2024, Pew Research found that only 21% of Americans think COVID is still a public health threat. And an Ipsos poll from the same year saw half of all Americans say they'll never get COVID again. Regardless of what any one person thinks, both of these realities are untrue. Like most important issues that end up sidelined, it takes the efforts of dedicated individuals to bring them back into the forefront. With the help of Austin DSA's COVID vaccine drive campaign and groups like Clear the Air ATX, local activists are working to do just that. COVID can be contracted anywhere at any time. And like other respiratory illnesses, COVID does have seasonal patterns of higher contraction. Conversely, COVID cases typically surge in both the summer and winter months, which is not the same for influenza or RSV. This can be attributed to a myriad of factors like temperature, humidity, or human behaviors, but the year-round presence of COVID means we don't see the massive drop-off after seasonal peaks like we do with other viruses. COVID's adaptability to mutate has also cultivated an environment where maintaining any kind of real immunity is difficult. As such, it remains imperative that people continue to stay diligent about keeping themselves up to date on the latest ways to keep themselves and others healthy. This starts with stressing the importance of getting vaccinated. Epidemiologists typically recommend getting vaccinated every 6 months, with an added emphasis on people who are 65 years old and over, and those with underlying health conditions. Doing so offers 30 to 60% additional protection against illnesses and severe disease. It's not just about avoiding COVID altogether, but avoiding the worst COVID has to offer as well. This additional protection does so much more than protect yourself. It also protects those around you, as preventing infections further reduces transmission by stopping future transmission chains. Austin DSA's COVID vaccine drive campaign aims to communicate the importance of public health measures that increase respiratory safety. To talk more about this, we have Ronnie from the Vaccine Drive campaign to help shed some light on their work here in town. Thanks so much for joining us, Ronnie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So let's just start with the origins of the Vaccine Drive campaign. What was the moment or need that pushed our DSA chapter to launch a vaccine drive in the first place?
Sure. So it's taken a fair bit of advocacy and time to get our chapter to start requiring respirators and having air filtration at our monthly general body meetings. But that has happened over the past 6 months or so, which is really exciting. And so our campaign is part of a larger accessibility caucus that is working to identify access needs and increase access at our events. So we identified that spreading some more awareness and education around vaccines falls under the realm of accessibility and making sure that our spaces, not just Austin DSA, but all of our spaces in town, are COVID safer for everybody. Um, and another reason for this is, we're seeing more and more people sick more often. And there seems to be a widespread lack about how COVID vaccines work, namely how often people need to be actually getting vaccinated, and what kinds of protection the vaccines actually provide. And so we're still pretty near the beginning of this vaccine drive and getting the word out, and we're viewing it as more of a long-term campaign. So we're hoping that the longer we go, the more people will benefit.
Amazing. So when you talk about some of those misconceptions that people already have, when you talk to people in the community, what are the biggest misconceptions about COVID or the vaccine that you still hear?
So a lot of people seem to think that getting their first COVID shot and then a couple of boosters after that is providing long-lasting protection, and that's just not true. The science is showing that a single COVID vaccine provides protection for pretty much a maximum of 6 months. So for folks who are only getting vaccinated once a year, they're only protected from severe illness or death for half of the year. Um, and the vaccines also don't actually prevent infection. Science is showing that maybe in some cases they do, but what they're really protecting against, like I just mentioned, are severe illness and death. So just because someone got a vaccine even a month or two ago doesn't mean that they can't be infected. And it doesn't mean that they can't also develop long COVID as a result of that infection. We're also seeing pretty widespread acceptance of being sick multiple times a year or more. Like some people are kind of just sick all the time and they've accepted that that's just how it is. But it really doesn't have to be that way. In addition to vaccines, high quality respirators or masks are really our first line of defense against respiratory illness. And when I say high quality respirators, I mean N95s and KN95s, masks of that caliber. I think it's really important for people to know that surgical masks do not protect or prevent COVID transmission. Surgical masks are designed to catch droplets, but not aerosolized droplets, which are the teeny, teeny, tiny droplets that linger in the air. So COVID as an aerosol lingers in the air like smoke. And what I've read, and I'm not exactly sure how up to date this is, but what I've read is that high quality respirators like N95s are actually 70 times more effective than surgicals at preventing the spread of COVID. Um, and then the another piece of this is that we don't all need to be breathing dirty air all the time, right? If we were all cleaning the air in every space, every public space that we're sharing, not only would people be sick a lot less often, but there's also a lot of other consequences to breathing high levels of CO2. Some of those consequences are headaches, fatigue, blood pressure issues, and dizziness. Um, as well as all of the other kinds of like allergens and pollen and viruses that are in the air indoors. So cleaning the air has a huge number of health benefits, and is overall like not that expensive to do. Even something as simple as opening the windows more often can have a really big impact. Um, and in terms of cleaning the air and kind of instituting these um, larger mitigations. What we saw at the beginning of the pandemic was that government buildings and institutions pretty immediately instituted, air purification and ventilation, as well as far UV technology. But those technologies were not extended or really shared with the wider public at all. So we've seen again this sort of this oppressive lack of response from the federal government when there could have been a lot more to help the general public not get COVID.
Totally. Yeah, and like you said, like so much of this is just like a lack of information being given to the public, and only being kept in a small group of people. I actually didn't know this, that surgical masks only protect against droplets and not airborne. And that's something that we talked about in the last interview with Clear the Air ATX, is that something that most people really don't know still at this point is that COVID is an airborne illness spread through the air. And that super helpful metaphor, it behaves kind of like secondhand smoke um, in the air. That's, yeah, super important for people to know. So, as we're talking about the misinformation landscape, what messaging strategies have you seen be the most effective so far?
Yeah, so in terms of our context in DSA as a socialist organization, talking about COVID in terms of it being a workers' rights issue is really critical, and I think the most impactful. There's a lot of crossover between the impacts of COVID and long COVID on working families and the impacts of, say, asbestos. So early on in the pandemic, there were several lawsuits where people were suing their employers for not having protections in place. So these people were getting COVID at work, they were spreading it to their families, resulting in long COVID, resulting in disability, high medical bills, all of the same things that people who were exposed to asbestos faced decades ago. The difference is that in the case of asbestos, OSHA treated it as employers were liable for those impacts, and people got their medical bills paid. They got, paid sick leave and all of these things, which were not given to the working class for COVID. And the reason given for that was, well, there would be so many lawsuits, it would completely tie up the courts nationwide. So I think a lot of people also may not remember that in the early pandemic, people were given paid time off, they were given sick leave, they were also instructed to stay at home until they were, consistently testing negative before they came to work. And once the Biden administration declared the pandemic to be over, all of those protections were taken away. And people literally, like most working class people, can't afford to stay home. They're going to work sick, and the cycle is perpetuated. And many people are becoming disabled because of it. And the other piece of COVID being a working class issue is that working class people are the demographic that is most impacted by COVID and long COVID. And this also includes people of the global majority, queer and trans folks, and women. Most of these people are working class, many of them are low income, and these are the demographics where we're seeing the highest numbers of long COVID cases. And so, as socialists, when we choose to mask, we are sending the message that we stand in solidarity with our fellow working class people, with our fellow marginalized people, and we're saying in a very public and material way that we care about what happens to us. And lastly, I'll say, pandemics are a tool of the colonizer. We see this time and time again throughout history that illness and disease are weaponized as tools of genocide. The history of Turtle Island being a prime example. And so we do not need to participate in that. We do not need to be complicit in that. And we do not need to allow the colonizing federal government to continue to kill us.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely been like a pervasive like idea that started at the beginning of, when COVID started spreading and has remained until now, that there's almost like an accepted like implied culling that's going to happen of like, you know, people who aren't being supported, like you said, by their workplaces that are, refusing to take any COVID mitigation precautions. Yeah, by not like instituting any of these policies, we are leaving so many people behind. So yeah, thank you so much for bringing light to that situation. What is something that you wish more people understood about COVID in 2025 that they still don't?
So tying this back to the question you previously asked, so much of what we're talking about is deeply rooted in ableism. And in the words of Cindy Lee, and many others, we are all just temporarily abled, right? So COVID and long COVID and other respiratory viruses in general are not safe for people to get over and over again, right? Getting COVID over and over is terrible for your immune system. It does not make your immune system stronger. That's just not how viruses work. That's not even how colds work, right? Um, and all of these viruses can and do lead to post-viral illness, which existed long before COVID ever became an issue. So even in people who are quote unquote healthy and able-bodied, we're seeing, high incidences of long COVID. I am one of those people who kind of fell into that former category and got long COVID. And for many people, long COVID is disabling, and people have been disabled for years and may very well be disabled for many years to come. And COVID, in addition to all kinds of things, could happen to any one of us at any time. Like any one of us could become disabled today or tomorrow or the next day. So the protections and the accommodations that we're talking about are for all of us. They're not just for disabled people, they're not just for immunocompromised people, they're for each and every one of us to try and stay as healthy and as able-bodied as we can so that we can continue to stay in the struggle for the world that we want to live in. In terms of the science of how COVID works, I'm not going to get super into it, but I think it is important for people to know that COVID in particular is a vascular disease, which means that it moves through the bloodstream of the body and kind of roots itself into our internal organs, including our brains, including our hearts. There have been studies of COVID versus flu in mice. And the flu, you could see, was pretty much limited to the lungs of the mouse, whereas COVID was found literally all over the body of the mouse, which is a really, really terrifying fact. Um, and so part of what happens when COVID's in our organs, and specifically the brain, is it causes what's called neuroinflammation for the long term, which means our brains are literally inflamed, causing things like brain fog, cognition issues and impairment, and even early onset dementia and possibly Alzheimer's. So this is very, very scary. And I think that the more people know about the long-term impacts of COVID, our hope is that more people will care about masking and getting vaccinated. COVID is a systemic issue that requires systemic solutions, systemic mitigations. And because the federal government is not providing those, we need to take it upon ourselves to do it for each other.
Totally. I think that's so important what you just said. I actually had no idea about COVID affecting the body like that. Like, how would you call that? I don't know, all different parts of the body.
Hmm.
Um, and it's kind of like, some of the misconceptions that most people have, which is that COVID is comparable to like the cold or a flu. Um, and like you just said, it actually impacts the body in like a completely different way. Um, so yeah, it's important for people to know that it's something different that we need to
Yeah.
understand as like a different illness. Kind of so what we were talking about earlier about you know, COVID mitigation being a working class issue and us participating in COVID mitigation, puts us in solidarity, puts us in a position of solidarity with working class people. How do you see mutual aid fitting into long-term public health strategy?
So we kind of how I've just shared, we all need to recognize, if we haven't already, that the government has pretty much abandoned us when it comes to COVID. We still have vaccines, but the latest vaccine, the fall 2025 vaccines, barely got pushed through. And it's very likely that we won't have them in the future. So it's really up to us to keep ourselves safe from COVID, from flu, from upcoming pandemics. The bird flu is very likely going to be the next pandemic, and it could happen really any time. That's kind of a separate conversation, but I wanted to mention it. Um, so there are so many ways we can help each other be more protected and be safer. We can check in with our friends and family to see if they've gotten the updated COVID vaccine, if they're getting the flu vaccine. If folks need rides to access them, we can offer that. For people who are uninsured, Austin Public Health does offer vaccine clinics, and I think they offer like a sliding scale pretty inexpensive model for accessing vaccines if you don't have insurance, but we can help each other, pay those co-pays if people need it. Um, and also help each other access PCR testing and molecular testing. I think a lot of folks don't realize there are, um, I guess, over-the-counter molecular tests that people can purchase. They're not very cheap, but they are testing devices. Metrics is the company that's currently available in the US. And you can get molecular tests at $25 a pop that to have on hand that are pretty much as sensitive as PCR tests. So there are ways that communities can identify who has access to those tests who can afford those tests, and how can we make those available to our comrades as well when they need them. And we also see community political education as a form of mutual aid, right? So people aren't going to care about COVID and other public health issues if they don't have access to the latest information and ways to keep each other safe. So spreading awareness, checking in with folks and letting them know about what we're learning is a really, really important piece of this. Um, and then finally, I would say, learning how to care for each other when we're sick, like the really basic meeting of material needs is really important. Sharing information and resources about different supplements and medications and antivirals that people can access is really important. And the most profound and important piece of disability justice as a movement, as a framework for living, is creating networks of care that we can lean into over time so that we know who needs what in our lives, who has access to what in our lives, and how can we pay and build relationships based on being able to provide that care for one another so that we're not having to rely on these external safety nets, which by and large don't really exist anymore, right? And ultimately, we need these networks of care to hold us as we continue to survive the threat of eugenics, essentially, of the threat of the powers that be treating disabled people as disposable, treating people of color as disposable.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, what you're saying there kind of underscores, I feel like, the theme of this whole episode, which is that caring for each other is like actually incredibly important. And obviously, as all of us as socialists know that like individualistic systems don't actually work. And causing people to put their health completely in their own hands is not effective, and it doesn't keep anyone around them safe as well. So yeah, thank you so much for that information. My final question for you is what support or participation does the campaign need the most right now? Would it be like volunteers, donations, or partnerships?
So, our primary mode of communication right now is flyering and flyers. So we have lots of flyers. We would love for people to get from us, to post in your workplaces, schools, communities, any public spaces that you have access to. And we have them in multiple languages. So whatever languages you might need, we can get them printed for you and get them to you. And if we don't already have that language, we can work on a translation for you. So we're really trying to reach as many people as possible, including those most marginalized in our communities who speak languages other than English. Um, I also just really want people to talk to your people about COVID, start normalizing again, talking about risk, about masking and getting vaccinated and cleaning the air and all of these mitigations that, when combined in a layered approach, are super, super effective at preventing COVID. We do not have to live with COVID forever, but if people continue to not consider risk and to not take precautions, we will be living with COVID forever. That's just a scientific reality. Um, and in terms of, encouraging people to mask, I think it can feel really overwhelming for people who stopped masking and are pretty much, in spaces where nobody else around them is masking. So we really recognize that that can feel intimidating. It can feel like a really big barrier to taking precautions. Um, and so we encourage you to reach out to us for support if that's something that you're concerned about or something your people are concerned about. There are ways to gently push back on people who are questioning you about masking, who may even be harassing you about masking. I've collected a lot of anecdotes just through my reading in different COVID cautious communities about experiences that people have being oftentimes the only masker or one of the only maskers in a space. Um, And so we're absolutely here to offer support to folks in that realm. And lastly, if anybody listening is working on some form of COVID advocacy in your spaces, or you would like to, please reach out. We would love to support you and perhaps team up to see how we can join forces and get the word out even further in our communities. We need each other to do this work because we are truly up against so much. My ability and my confidence to do advocacy around COVID has increased a lot because I now have so many COVID cautious friends. Like I have a really tight network of folks in my life who also mask and take precautions. And so that makes me feel so much more equipped to do so in spaces where people are not. So it's kind of, I see it as kind of a chain of reactions. Those of us who are taking precautions can slowly support other people to take precautions, and over time make it normal again to talk about COVID risk, just like we navigate HIV and other STI risk, right? Just as we navigate risks for cancer, not smoking and preventing secondhand smoking and all of these things that have become normal, so can COVID. And so that's our hope as well with this campaign.
Amazing. What's the best avenue for people to contact you if they wanted to get in touch with the campaign?
Awesome question. And I'm so glad you asked because I forgot to mention. We have a web page that's part of the greater Austin DSA website. So if you go to austindsa.org/COVID, COVID, you will find our campaign page and ways to get in contact with us. So, yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today and, imparting all of your wisdom. That was like super helpful. And for the work that you're doing in the campaign. I think this is an awesome effort from our chapter.
Yeah, you're so welcome. And thank you very much for having me.
So, where are we now and what can we do? Every day, COVID infects someone, whether they've had it before or not, whether they're vaccinated or not, whether they believe it exists or not. The risks associated with contracting the virus remain just as impactful as they did from the beginning. Above all else, our best defenses are masking up and getting vaccinated. Continue to exercise caution and concerns for ourselves and others, and prioritize mitigating spread. Continue to educate those closest to us about the realities of COVID in a supposedly post-pandemic world. And finally, join Austin DSA to get involved with like-minded people putting their best foot forward. If you own a business or are hosting an event, consider working with Clear the Air ATX to filter your venue. Taking action comes in many forms, all of which serve to make a difference.